This is part 2 of our discussion of sociological theory. We will address the question, how is sociological theory used to explain drug and alcohol use and associated phenomena? In this presentation, I will highlight a few specific theories and theoretical frameworks. Structural functionalist theory suggests that society can be conceptualized like an organism. Everything is interconnected and serves a function that keeps the organism alive. From this perspective, drug use serves a vital function for society because if it didn't, it would not exist. Some structural functionalists have identified what they believe is the function of deviance in society. Kai Erikson suggests that deviance serves to model bad or immoral behavior, as well as the extent to which engaging in that behavior will be accepted before sanctions are applied. We find support for this theory when examining popular school programs in the United States, such as DARE, and programs outside of schools, such as the Georgia Meth Project. Without drug and alcohol use, how exactly would one accomplish a war on drugs? To Erikson's point. Jay-Z and Molly Crabapple explain the war on drugs in this brief but informative film. Let's take a few minutes to observe.
In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. The sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the US blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the US prison population, disproportionately locking away Black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis, but there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated 50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to Black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in Black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared the so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
Marxist conflict theory is related to structural functionalist theory, but rather than ending with the explanation, deviance is functional, conflict theorists suggest that deviance is functional for those in power. Marxist conflict theory focuses specifically on social class as determining that power. Most conflict theorists today have moved away from Marxist renditions of conflict theory, instead highlighting the ways that marginalized statuses interact to determine the extent of one's power. Here, having a consistent class of drug-using individuals whose social mobility is limited due to their drug use is beneficial for those in power. It reduces the chances of being overthrown, in Marxian terms, and limits social competition for resources. Critical theories are used to question the reification of deviance through policy. In the case of drug use, critical theory critiques things like the scheduling of drugs, arguing that such actions serve to imply that drug use is objectively bad without thorough explanation for the claim. Critical theorists such as Michel Foucault argue that framing deviant behavior as objectively bad serves as a mechanism of social control for those in power. When applied to drug and alcohol use, Foucault's argument suggests that framing drug and alcohol use as objectively bad serves to increase the power of those assigned to control addicts and users, actors within the medical and criminal justice institutions. More current research using critical theory argues that policy that reifies drug use as deviant makes some groups, such as women, more vulnerable. For example, David Merola argues that while the war on drugs was promoted as a measure to protect women, there was evidence of women's increased vulnerability to arrest after the policy was enacted. Others apply similar arguments to medicalized drug use, pointing out that the presence of drugs to treat a condition is often followed by the use of drugs and/or medical surveillance to prevent that condition. Sometimes these preventive measures include the development of preconditions. For example, pre-diabetes, or labeling someone at high risk for stroke or heart disease. Joseph Dumit discussed this in his book, Drugs for Life. Critical race theorists developed the idea of the school-to-prison pipeline, in which they argue that drug policy in the United States has not eliminated drug use as promised, and has instead resulted in the criminalization of young people of color, especially those living in poverty. For example, Michelle Alexander points out that racial stereotypes linking Black people with criminalized drug use lead to the association of Blackness and criminality, regardless of behavior. Her book, The New Jim Crow, outlines in writing some of the things that Jay-Z and Molly Crabapple discussed in the film that we watched a few minutes ago. Exchange theory asserts that personal gain motivates human behavior. Therefore, drug and alcohol use occur when someone decides that use will be personally beneficial. As long as the net gain remains, that is, the benefit outweighs the risk or loss, drug and alcohol use will continue. For example, if you exist in a social circle that frames drug use as cool, engaging in drug use would increase your chances of fitting in. If that is your ultimate goal, it is unlikely that the risk or stigma associated with drug use will be enough to outweigh the benefit of social networking. Symbolic interaction theories explain behavior as the result of an ongoing process of negotiation between individuals and/or institutions regarding the meaning of symbols. A well-known sociological study of deviance uses symbolic interaction to explain cannabis use. Howard Becker explains that cannabis use does not simply occur, nor does it occur simply as the result of exposure to other drug use or the idea that drug use should be appealing. Becker finds that his participants begin drug use only after a series of interactions with other drug users, during which they used drugs, felt high, identified the drugs as the source of the high, and defined the sensation of high as pleasurable or positive. Becker's theory of symbolic interaction has come to be known as labeling theory. Another symbolic interaction theory, phenomenology, extends labeling theory to suggest that subjective experiences of the involved parties will determine the labeling process. It helps explain situations left unexplained by labeling theory. For example, why some individuals do not become drug users despite frequent and repeated interaction and drug use with those who identify as drug users. Lee and Moore use phenomenology to extend labeling theory, suggesting that some opioid users are unlikely to identify or be identified as an addict. They find that disabled individuals who were not previously diagnosed with a substance use disorder and who were prescribed opioid medications by a physician did not identify themselves as addicts, despite meeting the criteria for diagnosis of substance use disorder, or SUD. They link this directly to the biomedical conceptualization of opioid use by disabled people. Because disabled people in these circumstances are using prescribed medication within the guidelines provided by their doctor, they are not conceptualized as deviant. In essence, neither physicians nor their disabled patients identify opioid use as problematic in the specific context or phenom of medication compliance. The addict label is subject to the functional ability of the patient and the predefined threshold for deviant drug use. Ethnomethodology takes its explanation of drug use one step further than phenomenology to explain what phenomenology cannot. Why is there variation in the set threshold determining whether drug use is deviant? Phenomenology cannot look at this because it looks at a singular context. Ethnomethodology explains that meanings are fluid and situational. Every interaction involves the production, reproduction, and changing of definitions over the course of the interaction when introduced with updated information, i.e., the context changes. To provide an example, let's use the case of opioid use by disabled patients. Ethnomethodology reveals that the situation of doctor prescribes opioid, patient takes opioid, patient complies, patient is assumed non-deviant, is not a binary if-then. Instead, it is a situation that may change both over the course of a single clinical interaction and over the course of several clinical interactions. It is possible, for example, that a blood test taken during the clinical interaction reveals information about the patient's drug use that differs from their verbal report. What was originally defined as compliance may now be defined as deception. Lee and Moore their findings suggest that if this occurs, the patient will be labeled an addict for their drug use behavior. Ethnomethodology challenges the notion that symbols are interpreted uniformly as the norm. It also suggests that when given the same information, two individuals will interpret that information differently if there is any variation in subjective experience prior to or during the interaction. Say the opioid-using patient needs to switch doctors and their new doctor recently lost a loved one to opioid overdose. This doctor may not prescribe opioids in the same way, and if so, ethnomethodology suggests it is because of the doctor's subjection to a negative experience with opioids. The doctor's subjective experiences outside of the clinical encounter impacted their understanding within the clinical encounter, which in turn impacted their prescribing behavior. Reference group theory suggests that people will model their actions on the actions of those in their peer group. Using this theory, drug use is explained as the result of one's peers engaging in drug use. It does not provide a means of identifying the peer group that one is referencing, nor does it explain why seeing peers engage in a behavior is so appealing.